In this video, I'm going to run through the very first settings I change on every Canon camera to maximize image quality, usability, and overall performance. Right, working through the menu, the very first thing I always check is the file format in photography mode. So I shoot in RAW along with a small JPEG file. So I don't use full-size JPEGs because they can eat up a lot of card space, but I like having a small JPEG alongside the RAW just for things like quick previews, for backups and archiving, especially since they're just so much faster to view on my MacBook than RAW files. Now let's take a look at the camera's display, because right now your screen on your Canon camera is probably lying to you. And that brings us to picture style, and a lot of people think this doesn't matter if you're shooting RAW, and technically that is true. But I think there are still a couple of reasons that it's definitely worth paying attention to your picture profile. And each picture style has a very distinct look, and I do choose my picture style based on the shoot that I'm doing. So for example, standard is very contrasty and saturated, so it can look really great for landscapes, but I find that it's often a little bit too punchy for portraits or particularly high dynamic range scenes, where I kind of prefer the softer, more natural look of the faithful profile. And I like to be intentional with my color profile, because it's not only what people see on the back of the camera when I'm sharing images on set, but the picture style also becomes your starting point for your color profile in Lightroom. And whilst obviously you can absolutely change this later on when you shoot RAW with no penalty in Lightroom, it is nice to not have to fix that after the fact. And a quick side note on that that's definitely worth mentioning is if you are leaving your color profile in Lightroom set to Adobe Color, you are definitely not seeing true Canon colors. Adobe Color is fine if you shoot across multiple different camera systems for consistency, but if you are a Canon shooter, I strongly recommend using the camera-specific profiles. And honestly, if that's the only thing that you take away from this video, then that is a good thing, and that is definitely something you should start doing. Anyway, if you're struggling with exposure, especially say clipping the highlights in really tricky scenes, then I definitely recommend switching your picture profile to neutral for a while, because in my experience, neutral gives you the most honest exposure preview on the back of the camera, because it lowers contrast a little bit, it lowers sharpening and saturation, and it just makes what you see on the LCD and through the EVF much closer to the real raw exposure latitude in my experience. And you can go further and even drop the contrast and saturation further in camera to get an even more raw-like preview. If you have just left your camera in the standard profile, then highlights and shadows do look like they're clipping much sooner than they actually are. And in reality, when you're shooting RAW, you usually have quite a bit more wiggle room than the preview on the back of the camera suggests. So that means, yes, your screen is actually lying to you when it comes to things like exposure, and that can just make it a lot more difficult to judge how to expose a scene. Now, I've been shooting with Canon cameras for years now, so I've got a pretty good feel for exposure, regardless of what the preview shows me on the screen, and you will definitely get there as well with a little bit of time. But if you are still learning or you're just struggling with exposure, then neutral is a really, really great place to start. And it's actually become kind of my go-to picture style, both in camera and in Lightroom more recently, because I think it gives you more of a kind of true to life look and really natural skin tones. So maybe just give it a try anyway and let me know what you think. Now let's stay on exposure, because there are a couple of kind of key settings that I always change to help me get the correct exposure. And first up is the metering timer. So I always set this to around 30 seconds instead of 5. And that keeps the exposure meter at the bottom of the camera on screen for much longer than default. So as I kind of move the camera around and recompose or the light changes, I'm constantly getting up-to-date exposure feedback. Not exposure related, but whilst we're in this section, I always turn off release shutter without card. That way, if I do forget to put an SD card in my camera, I'm not going to accidentally take a whole bunch of photos before I realize that there's no card in the camera. The camera just won't let me do that now. But the most powerful exposure tool on most Canon cameras is the histogram, and I always have it enabled in both photo and video. It is one of the best ways to expose a scene accurately. But there is something very important that you need to know when shooting RAW photos, and that is that the histogram is always based on a JPEG preview, not the actual raw data. In fact, anything you ever see on your LCD screen whether it's a live view or playback, is always a JPEG preview. You're never actually seeing the raw file itself. And what that means is, in practice, with a raw file, you usually have around, say, 2/3 to even a full stop of extra highlight recovery in that raw file than the preview or even the histogram shows. So that means if your exposure looks good on the histogram, or with zebras, for example, you've normally got still a little bit of headroom left in the raw file. And now for photography, I always very slightly underexpose my images to protect the highlights, because I found that, without a doubt, Canon mirrorless cameras are absolutely excellent when it comes to recovering shadow detail, and it's nearly always safer to pull shadows up in post than trying to fix blown highlights. So as a rough guide, just using the meter, I usually aim to be about 1/3 of a stop under the center marker or so, depending on the scene. Video though is actually kind of the opposite, and that's really important. So we're going to come back to that properly later on in the video section. Next, one of the absolute biggest things that I always change in terms of the display on my camera is I go straight into shooting info display, and I always turn on the grid. Specifically the 3x3 grid. And for me, the 3x3 grid isn't about following rules or something like that. It is about removing guesswork, because on a small screen, it gives your eye reference points so you can judge things like balance, headroom, and it just really helps you compose an image. And yeah, I really do use it for everything, from placing a model's eye line on the top third line to making sure a landscape frame feels balanced using these lines. Turning this on has massively improved my compositions in both photo and video. Another useful setting you might not be aware of is hidden in display simulation. So by default, no matter what aperture you set your camera to when you're shooting, the camera actually focuses with the lens wide open. That means your depth of field preview on the back of the camera never actually changes. This lets more light into the lens, and it just helps the autofocus system perform better. But if you do want an accurate preview of what your actual depth of field looks like as you change your aperture, you can change this setting here from exposure to exposure plus DOF. And this is just so handy for situations where you really need to see what is in focus in an image. Now, not all Canon mirrorless cameras have this. Some of the early models, like the original R6 and R5, I think, don't have it, so do bear that in mind, but I'm pretty sure every other Canon mirrorless camera has it. But if your camera does support it, you're going to get a much more accurate depth of field preview, and this is useful even for portraits. You can kind of see just how blurry your background is going to be, what you're obscuring and what you're including in the frame, and that's really useful to see sometimes. And guys, before we carry on, this video is sponsored by Squarespace, and as a photographer, having a website that showcases your work is an absolute must in my opinion, and it just doesn't get any easier than Squarespace, because there's no coding or design skills needed. It's pretty much just drag and drop, and now Squarespace even have amazing AI tools like Design Intelligence or Blueprint AI, all of which help you create a personalized website in just a few easy steps. And of course, in my opinion, the fully customizable photo galleries are just perfect for showing off your portfolio to potential clients. And Squarespace also has fantastic e-commerce tools that I rely on, and it just makes setting up an online store a breeze, and it means you can start selling in no time and handle many different types of payments seamlessly thanks to Squarespace payments. So if you're ready to dive in and get started, head on over to squarespace.com/JamesReader and use code JamesReader for 10% off your first domain or website. Next up, let's talk autofocus settings, and honestly, I don't really change a huge amount here because autofocus is very, very situational, and I don't want to kind of overprescribe, but there are a few settings I always pay attention to. And the first thing I do is I lock my subject detection to whatever I'm actually shooting, rather than just leaving it in auto. Auto subject detection has gotten better with every single Canon release, and it's going to work for you most of the time. But if I'm shooting people, so a couple shoot, portraits or a wedding, I'm going to lock it to people. And of course, if I'm shooting wildlife, I'll set it to animal. I just find that choosing the subject myself happens to usually be more accurate and more reliable than leaving it in auto mode. And the only time I really ever do leave it in auto these days is when I'm traveling and kind of shooting a wide mix of subjects and I just don't really know what I'm going to be capturing on the day. Then I'll just leave it in auto. Next, I always remove autofocus from the shutter button completely, and I move it to the back button autofocus on button. I don't want the half press of the shutter to focus at all. I want a dedicated button for that, and this AF on button at the back just gives me so much more control over autofocus in my experience. It also has a lot of other advantages, to be honest, so definitely give it a try if you haven't already. Another important setting is focus priority. So if this is set to release, which it is by default, the camera will fire even if the subject isn't in focus. So I make sure it's set to focus, which means the camera won't take the shot unless focus is actually achieved, and this leads to sharper shots. On most Canon cameras, this mainly affects one-shot AF, but on newer bodies, you're also going to get this option for servo AF. So I make sure that this is set to focus priority in both of these settings. Something else I always pay attention to on every single shoot is my shutter mode. So on most Canon mirrorless cameras, you're going to have three options here. So you've got mechanical shutter, electronic first curtain shutter, and fully electronic shutter. And I've got another video about sharpness and things that goes deeper into this, but to keep things simple, for most situations, if I'm shooting under 1/1000th of a second, then I shoot using electronic first curtain shutter. Electronic first curtain shutter can help you get sharper images at these kind of slower shutter speeds because it reduces shutter shock. But once you go above around 1/1000th of a second, again, it can introduce some issues like slightly uneven or slightly odd looking bokeh. So above that, I always switch over to full mechanical shutter. Personally, I generally avoid fully electronic shutter unless I absolutely need the fastest burst rate possible. And the reason is that on most Canon cameras, electronic shutter, fully electronic shutter, drops the bit depth of your RAW files from 14-bit to 12-bit. And this can result in slightly noisier shadows in some situations. But to be fair, in good light, even with that trade-off, electronic shutter is usually totally fine, and I promise you, you're probably not going to see much of a difference. But I will avoid using it under artificial lighting to prevent banding, or in situations where rolling shutter could become an issue, which isn't very often for me, to be fair. Now, if you're using a camera like the Canon RP or the R8 or the R50V, for example, you don't actually have the option for a full mechanical shutter. Because of that, on my RP and my R8, ever since I bought those cameras, had them for years now, I've just left them constantly in electronic first curtain shutter all of the time because of that, and I rarely have any issues with that mode. And if you do just want to pick one setting to kind of set and forget, then I choose that mode. All right, now let's talk about video settings. So for maximum dynamic range and flexibility in post, I generally always shoot in a log profile. So you turn it on here under Canon log settings, and I prioritize using C-Log2 if my camera supports it, and if not, I'll just use C-Log3. I then always enable the view assist because without it, the preview is going to look very kind of dark and flat. You're just seeing the log image, and turning this on gives you a much more usable, contrasty preview on the LCD whilst you're shooting. I also always change the color space to cinema gamut, and this gives you maximum color headroom, and in my experience, you're just going to get the best image quality and kind of grading flexibility in post using this mode. That said, even though log does give you the most dynamic range, there's no doubt about it, I actually do shoot in Rec 709 quite often, especially on the newer cameras like the R5 Mark II and the R6 Mark III. Canon's newer Rec 709 wide dynamic range profiles actually look really great straight out of camera. And in fact, this talking head clip that you're watching right now is just recorded in Rec 709. It's not recorded in log at all. Because I want to save time, it already looks great. The colors straight out of camera look fantastic, and this isn't a tricky scene. I've got full control over the lighting, so I'm just going to save time and shoot in Rec 709. So yeah, any situation where I'm controlling the lighting or it's just not a particularly tricky scene, so product B-roll, for example, again, I always use Rec 709 for that. But I will never use it in high dynamic range outdoor scenes because log just always makes more sense there. Also, easily 90% of what you see on my YouTube channel is recorded in long GOP. So some Canon cameras will offer you intra-frame codecs or raw codecs, but for my work, I'd rather save the card space and stick with long GOP, and I think that the kind of sacrifice in image quality is almost imperceivable for the most part, and yeah, I'd rather save the card space. And for white balance in video, I always lock it. I never rely on auto white balance in video because a kind of white balance shift mid-clip instantly looks amateur. And in daylight, I'll often lock it to around 5200 Kelvin. And that gives me enough flexibility to kind of correct slightly in post without having to make kind of large adjustments. So obviously, use the appropriate preset or Kelvin value for whatever situation you're in. So if you're shooting under tungsten lighting, then there's a preset for that, or in the shade, for example. Now your camera might have tools like waveform or false color, which are great for judging exposure. But before those were common, not that they're really common yet on Canon cameras, I relied on just the histogram for video for years. When shooting C-Log on Canon cameras, I generally expose brighter than I ever would for photo. And I'll use the histogram to do this and just adjust my settings or say my variable ND filter so that the brightest parts of the scene on the histogram sit just below the right-hand edge. And this is called exposing to the right, where you're intentionally pushing more of the image data that you're capturing towards the right-hand side of the histogram. If you just expose your log footage the same way you would for your photos, then this is just going to lead to really noisy shadows. Slightly brighter exposures, while still protecting your highlights of course, give you cleaner shadows, better color and nicer contrast once graded. I've experimented with all kinds of different ways of exposing this C-Log footage, and this is the best way in my experience. Also, if you're just starting out, then zebras are a great safety net. So you could set Zebra 1 to around 95%, for example. So if you do see stripes, lower your exposure until they just disappear, and then that's probably a good exposure. But remember, if you do have direct light sources in the scene, like the sun, for example, that is always going to trigger zebras, so just ignore those, that's fine. Another really useful trick for getting consistent skin tones is setting Zebra 2 to around 70%. So as you raise your exposure, you're looking for those zebras to just start appearing on the brightest side of the face. So in this shot, for example, my key light is here. So you would want the zebras to just start showing on this side of my face. If the stripes are showing everywhere, that means you're probably overexposing. And if you don't see them at all, then the skin is likely a bit too dark and underexposed. So I'm aiming for those zebras to just kind of kiss the highlights of the face, which usually puts skin in a really good place in terms of exposure. And exposing for the skin tones is such an important thing to learn how to do for scenes like this, where there's no bright highlights, we're not outdoor with a bright sun, and we want to prioritize great skin tones, and setting your zebras to around 70% and exposing for that will generally get you amazing skin tones. I also changed this setting, which is in the red menu on the third page, and it's called AV 1/8 stop increment. And turning this on means you can adjust your aperture in 1/8 stops. So this allows me to make much finer exposure adjustments in video without obvious jumps. So this is great for fine adjustments or more natural looking exposure changes. You can almost treat it like a kind of declicked aperture ring. Also, if you've been struggling with battery life, especially on cameras like the R8 or the RP, I would strongly recommend turning airplane mode on. So this disables Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and in my experience, it not only extends battery life while shooting, but if you've been struggling with any kind of battery drain whilst your camera's off, then this will probably fix that. One last thing I always set up on every single Canon camera is My Menu. And this is basically a custom menu where you can pin the settings that you use the most, so you're not constantly digging through pages to find them. So I'm always adding things like shutter mode, I add Canon log settings, and I add format card as well. So these are just things that I'm often changing at shoots, and now I don't have to go rooting through the menus to find them. All right, that is it. So those are just some of the very first settings I always change when I'm setting up a new Canon camera. But of course, I'm sure there's plenty of settings that I've missed or forgotten. So let me know down in the comments what other kind of small tweaks or changes you make to really personalize your Canon camera. Hopefully this video was useful. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.